And we're picking up on Chapter 8 of Barry and the Boys, The CIA, the Mob, and America's Secret History by Daniel Hopsicker. It's a bit windy today. I think the fastest wind we clocked today is 33 miles an hour, so hopefully it's not too windy for the microphone, Okay, Chapter 8. Double check cowboys at the Bay of Pigs. Who recruited the pilots, guerrilla fighters, and saboteurs needed for the Bay of Pigs and subsequent anti-Castro operations? For that job, the CIA used the Double Check Corporation, a Miami and New Orleans-based CIA front. Double Check was run by Alex Carlson, a big, blonde, heavy-set man towering well over 6 feet, who had seen 3 years of combat during World War II in the Pacific. While finishing law school at the University of Miami, he went to South America on an exchange scholarship. Funny how the continent of South America had such a seemingly strong allure for so many in our story. George Deuel, Barry Seal, David Ferry, even Nelson Rockefeller, who ran PSYOPs there during World War II. Double Check, just one of a number of interchangeable CIA fronts used, was first exposed in The Invisible Government by Washington journalist David Weiss. Barry Seal, who was already flying missions into Cuba, was sheep-dipped into the Alabama Air National Guard in Birmingham, run by General Reed Doster. And even after the Bay of Pigs debacle was over, the Alabama Air National Guard would continue to be used as cover for Pilot Seal, who participated in a number of Caribbean and Central American operations while based in Alabama. One postcard home from Seal came from Montgomery, Alabama, at the end of June in 1961, complete with a photo of the completely air-conditioned Albert Pike Motel on the front. "Just call me a freedom rider," Seal writes. "I'd better shut up before I get shot." And another month later, bearing the same Montgomery postmark, he calls himself a watermelon-eating son of the South. The pilots Seal learned to fly with, very young contemporaries in Baton Rouge, could now only look in envy at their young hotshot friend. They were still flying small single-engine aircraft, while Seal, barely out of his teens, now flew in and out of Baton Rouge in a rotating series of ever more powerful twin-engine aircraft. The brewing covert war was pretty much an open secret among Southern pilots. It was nothing to see paramilitary flights taking off from commercial airports under transparent business covers from isolated airstrips and mothballed military fields in Florida and Louisiana. Less visible were the landings at the other end, at impoverished runway strips hacked out of the jungles in Guatemala, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Cuba, landings which provided Seal excellent training for his later career. Under General Doster was assembled a CIA force that eventually numbered 80 Americans. The CIA gave Doster 45 days to get ready. The general worked almost around the clock. The mission sounded foolproof to him, although he had been told next to nothing except for his part of the operation would be as just a small cog in a large machine. He had confidence and had to assume that the logistics were available and the planning had been done. He said later his briefings convinced him that the surprise invasion would throw Cuba into turmoil. The population was supposed to be waiting for this and would gladly join the men of the brigade as they landed. Doster did his best to measure up to the CIA's intense feelings about secrecy. Every new recruit heard from him, "If you open your goddamned mouth, I'll have your ass." One of the enduring secrets about the Bay of Pigs invasion concerns the large role of American pilots played far beyond the admitted training of exile Cuban pilots and combat flights on the last day of the invasion. So great was the stress on secrecy that even today one of the last remaining living American Bay of Pigs pilots, James Harrison, is reluctant to discuss his Central American training mission. "I didn't train anyone, frankly," he finally admitted to us. "I was expected to fly combat. What happened was that in a foretaste of things to come in Vietnam, where the South Vietnamese army was usually nowhere to be seen, invasion planners came to have doubts about the motivation of some of the exile Cuban pilots they were training, and in January of 1961 the agency requested the use of American contract pilots. Barry Seal's first postcard home from Guatemala bears a February 1961 postmark. None of the CIA advisors used their real names, but they used names which sounded enough like their names so they would remember to respond when somebody shouted out their alias. Thus, the CIA Air Force commander at the Happy Valley Air Base, whose real name was Garfield, became Gar. General Reed Doster used his name Reed when he was at Retaliahule as a CIA advisor. "We all use aliases," Harrison told us, and while the eccentric-looking Dave Ferry alias remains a mystery, Barry Seals became known when we discovered that one of the CIA pilots has used the alias Billy Belt. Billy Belt, Barry Seal, and Billy Belt's description in The Invisible Government as a young instructor fits the 21-year-old Barry Seal, who still dutifully wrote home from Guatemala to his parents during the preparations of the invasion, letting everyone know he was all right. One postcard he sent from Guatemala features a picture of the lake at Amatitian. Dated 3 weeks before April 19th invasion, Barry writes, "Hi, I am probably going to stay at this picture a couple of days. See you soon." Barry also stayed at the Mayas Excelsior Hotel in Guatemala City, where the CIA pilots were put up, and that is where his anxious mother wrote him back, assuring him postcards were appreciated. "Received your 2 cards and the letter as well. Thrilled to hear from you." Sentimentally, Barry kept his mother's cards his entire life. 4 Alabama Guard pilots were killed during the Bay of Pigs, all on a mission to cover the beachhead on the final day of the invasion. According to the excellent Deadly Secrets, the exile Cuban pilots had become an intractable problem by then. The brigade pilots were grim. All were exhausted. Many were disgusted. Some had turned chicken. They were no longer making extra turns over targets. Gar found that only about 1/3 were ready to go. With the others, the Americans had to beg them to go. By now, it took several hours to get some of their crews in the aircraft, and then they aborted the mission. They constantly found excuses not to do the job. You could count the number of tigers on one hand. The Cubans had been asked to fly a support mission at the beachhead, where the situation was deteriorating rapidly. They demanded to know why the mission was so important. "We must hold 24 hours more," a CIA advisor told them, in an allusion to the 72-hour period after which a government in arms could be declared and outside American military assistance requested. Castro, too, was aware of this deadline. He later told foreign newsmen that it became an urgent political problem for us to oust them as quickly as possible so they would not establish a government there. The reason was simple. Once the magic hour arrived, the anti-Castro Cuban provisional government would be flown in to proclaim a new government. When that happened, CIA planners had convinced themselves President Kennedy would permit Marines to save the day. Led by American pilot Buck Persons, who had combat experience in Mustangs during World War II, the mission was to land at the Bay of Pigs airfield and refuel from drums that had been dropped off there. 6 B-26s took off in pairs at half-hour interval beginnings at 3 a.m. The pilots believed that the mission would be given air cover by Navy jets starting at 6:30 in the morning. As dawn broke over the Bay of Pigs, the first B-26 arrived. One had no co-pilot. A Cuban co-pilot had jumped out of the cockpit and vanished into the woods as the plane was taxiing at Happy Valley. The planes picked out concentrations of Fidel's blue-clad militia and began strafing. Soon more B-26s with American crews were on the scene in bombing and strafing runs. But they had soon became alarmed that the promised cover of Navy jets hadn't showed up. "How about our little friends?" one pilot radioed another. "See any of them?" "I didn't see anybody," the other replied, and then heard the first pilot shout, "I'm hit and on fire." T-Bird's Cuban jet fighters shot them up before the Navy jets due over the beach showed up. Right on time, they thought, but a full hour too late to help the beleaguered flyers. The time fouled up was not satisfactorily explained until the report on the CIA's performance was declassified and released 30 years later. It showed a monumental breakdown in communication between the CIA and the Navy had cost 4 American pilots their lives due to the difference in time zones. The Navy was on East Coast time and used 6:30 as the hour of dawn, while the CIA pilots at Happy Valley in Nicaragua used Central Time and had already scheduled the B-26s to begin arriving at the first glimmer of light near an hour earlier. What happened to the dead pilots' widows, known as the Birmingham Widows, is instructive because it is repeated to the widow of Barry Seal. It is a story of misery inflicted on widows by the CIA's insistence on keeping the American people in the dark. The CIA knew it wasn't pulling anything over on Castro. He was well aware of who his advisors were. Alex Carlson, the lawyer fronting for Double Check Corporation, had the task of keeping the lid on the deaths of the Americans in the invasion. He visited the widows, telling them that their husbands had vanished on a C-46 cargo flight in Central America. He said that Double Check had hired the 4 at a monthly salary to fly cargo. These men knew what they were getting into, he added. It was a calculated risk if any of them came back. They had a nice nest egg. The widows were furious at Carlson's words. To cover its role, the CIA was willing to imply that their husbands had been mercenaries, and they resented the implication. Riley wasn't a soldier of fortune, one said. He didn't do this for the money. He was a test pilot at Hayes Aviation and was paid a good salary there. He was an operations officer for the for the Air National Guard. Another told a newspaper interviewer that her husband was no soldier of fortune either. She said he was paid $1,880 a month during the short period of time he was away. She, too, had been visited by Carlson. He said my husband was dead and to start a life anew. He said they spotted one of the plane's engines floating in the water. I didn't think the engines floated. This widow stated bitterly. All they could get out of authorities in Washington was a runaround. One dead pilot's mother, Riley Schamberger, took it on herself to do something about it. She carried on an energetic correspondence with the federal government to find out what had happened to her son, even writing the Swiss government, which handled affairs for the United States and Cuba. She received a reply from the acting chief of the Protection and Representation Division of the State Department. It said, "Your letters to the Department of State concerning your son have been referred to me for reply. The records in this office do not contain the circumstances surrounding your son's accident. At the time, he was not on active duty in his military status. For more detailed information, it is suggested you contact the Hayes Aircraft Corporation, Birmingham, Alabama, since he was under their jurisdiction at the time in question. Hayes Aircraft, a private corporation, has no one under its jurisdiction." So the letter was deceptive. A lesser woman might have been discouraged. Instead, she wrote CIA Director John McCone and received a reply on CIA stationery. "In Mr. McCone's absence, I am replying to your letter of June 1962 requesting information concerning your son. I am sorry to disappoint you, but this agency is unable to furnish you any such information. Also, we have made inquiries of other government departments, and these too have no pertinent information. We have every sympathy for you in your natural concern for the fate of your son, and I am sorry as I can be that we cannot help. Please be assured that if at any time we are able to furnish information, we will contact you promptly." Miss Schamberger then went right to the very top. An aide to the president, a brigadier general, wrote back, "If any information is obtained on the circumstances surrounding the loss of your son, you will be informed immediately. Unfortunately, at the present, neither CIA nor any other government agency possesses the slightest pertinent information on your son's disappearance." Riley Schamberger's mother was determined to keep trying. "I am not going to give up," she said bitterly. "They take your boy away and never let you know what happened." After a brief flurry of publicity right after the Bay of Pigs, the story of 4 missing Americans dropped out of the news until Senator Everett Dirksen of Illinois leaked the news that 4 American flyers had been killed at the Bay of Pigs. He said he had learned this in the course of a one-man inquiry into the Cuba invasion. Dirksen's disclosure was embarrassing for the Kennedy administration. Just 5 days before the invasion, President Kennedy had said, "This government will do everything it possibly can, and I think it can meet its responsibilities to make sure that no Americans are involved in actions inside Cuba," and Attorney General Robert Kennedy had stated no Americans died at the Bay of Pigs. After Dirksen's statements, when newsmen sought out the elderly Miss Schamberger, she told them plaintively if no Americans were involved, she said, "Where is my son?" Now alarmed, the White House issued a statement extending the president's heartfelt sympathy and explaining that the government had unfortunately no information to add to that which had been conveyed before. The charade finally ended at a press conference when Kennedy was asked, "Mr. President, can you say whether the 4 Americans who died in the Bay of Pigs invasion were employees of the government or the CIA?" Kennedy hemmed and hawed, but to his credit finally gave a truthful answer, one which helped the widows bring closure to their questions of what had happened to their loved ones. Let me say just about these 4 men. They were serving their country, Kennedy declared. The flight had cost them their lives, was a volunteer flight, and while because of this nature of their work, it has not been a matter of public record, as it might be in the case of soldiers or sailors, I can say that they were serving their country. Secret history always repeats itself, at least until it's exposed. Debbie Seal, Barry Seal's widow, raised their 3 small children without knowing what to tell them about who it was their father had been. Was he just a sleazy drug smuggler, or was he instead a CIA pilot whose job was flying drugs? When Barry Seal was murdered, we never received one call from anyone in the government, Debbie Seal told us. It was as if no one he worked with knew who he was. A sleazy drug smuggler was what Seal was called by Arkansas's police Larry Nichols. No stranger to sleaze himself. In the Clinton Chronicles, intel agent at Baptist minister Pat Matrician's million-selling video slamming Bill Clinton. If Nichols were right and Barry Seal was indeed just a sleazy drug smuggler, then the far right was correct in calling Bill Clinton a Dixie Mob president. But Barry Seal was, as we are beginning to see, a lifelong employee of American clandestine services. The Republicans behind the Clinton Chronicles presumably do this. If they didn't, they're not slickly efficient fat cats we all know them to be. When Barry Seal died, his widow lived for more than a decade after his death underneath the threat of a $29 million jeopardy assessment from the Internal Revenue Services, which she had absolutely no hope of paying. This did wonders to keep her from doing much talking to reporters. One time, while defending herself from the IRS Inquisition, she stumbled on a frequently called phone number in Barry's phone records. Thinking it might be some vendor from whom she could procure receipts to show the IRS she dialed it. "Where did you get this number?" a hostile voice demanded after she had explained the reason for her call. "This is a secret DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, phone number. You are never to call it again." Later that day, she received a friendlier phone call from someone else in Washington, D.C. "Debbie, you're young. You have a whole life ahead of you, and your kids to think about." A kindly voice advised her in an ironic echo of Alex Carlson's advice to Birmingham widows 25 years earlier. Then in a stern tone, the voice on the phone issued a warning. "I'm going to speak to you now as I would to one of my two daughters. You've got a whole life ahead of you. Don't call anyone in Washington again." And it's getting a little crazy out here, as you can see, and we're going to cut it off for today.